I will tell you what I submitted in the restricted report and what I did not. The report is 41 pages. It is classified Tier 5 under the Vthrani Conclave's Emergency Doctrine Protocols, which means it requires the full signature panel of 7 senior counselors to be accessed, and it has not been accessed since I filed it. The summary is 4 lines. The 4 lines say, the joint simulation exercise at Outpost Kethdavorn produced comparative performance data inconsistent with established interspecies crisis response modeling. The human advisory delegation performed outside all predicted parameters. The findings are classified pending doctrinal review. Further simulation exercises involving human participants are suspended until the review concludes. That is the summary. What the summary does not contain is the reason the review has not concluded. It has been 11 months. No one on the panel has submitted the review. I am going to tell you what I saw. My name is Surith Vane. I hold the rank of Senior Doctrine Analyst within the Vthrani Conclave of Emergency Doctrine, which is the body responsible for interspecies crisis response coordination across the 14 signatory civilizations of the Keth Accords. I have served in this position for 22 years. Before that, I spent a decade as a field observer embedded with the Orvith Collective's Emergency Response Corps, which means I have seen crisis events, real ones, not modeled ones, involving 6 different species across 9 different scenarios. I am not easily rattled. My colleagues will confirm this. I am telling you this now because I want you to understand that what I am about to describe is not the impression of someone who had not seen much. I had seen a great deal. The exercise at Outpost Kethdavorn was a routine comparative doctrine review. We run them every 4 years. The purpose is to measure how well the 14 signatory species perform against standardized extinction tier crisis scenarios in a controlled simulation environment. Not to evaluate individual competence, but to calibrate interspecies response protocols. If the Vthrani and the Orvith Collective are expected to coordinate a joint response to, say, a cascading stellar impact event affecting 3 inhabited systems, we need to know, with some precision, how each species' decision-making structure behaves under that class of pressure. Different species fragment differently. Different species freeze on different triggers. The point of the simulation suite is not to find out who is best. The point is to find out where each species' doctrine breaks so we can build coordination protocols that don't rely on the broken places. I had run 6 prior comparative reviews. The patterns were, by that point, reasonably well established. Every species we had ever tested degraded under sufficiently severe crisis pressure. This is not a criticism. It is physiology. When a civilization-ending scenario reaches a certain probability threshold, when the modeled outcome shifts from severe damage to population mortality above 40% with low recovery likelihood, every intelligent species we have studied shows measurable deterioration in coordinated decision-making. The exact mechanisms differ by species. The Orvith Collective, whose hive integration architecture is otherwise extraordinarily efficient, shows a fragmentation pattern at high casualty projections. The collective integration begins to decohere as individual nodes prioritize self-preservation routing over collective function. The Verath Dominion, whose command hierarchy is rigid and deeply centralized, shows a different failure mode. The chain of command calcifies under pressure, with senior nodes refusing to authorize decisions below a certainty threshold they cannot reach because the information does not exist yet. The Solvith, whose distributed consensus model is elegant in stable conditions, shows what our modeling team calls consensus collapse. They cannot reach agreement fast enough when the situation is changing faster than their deliberation cycle. None of this is shameful. It is what nervous systems do when the survival equation stops resolving. The function of the Emergency Doctrine Conclave is to build frameworks that account for these degradation patterns, so that interspecies coordination doesn't collapse at the worst possible moment. What we had never done, in 6 prior comparative reviews, was include a human team. The Human Advisory Delegation was a late addition to the Keth-Davorn exercise. Late is an understatement. The inclusion was confirmed 18 days before the simulation window, following a diplomatic exchange I was not party to. My understanding, from the briefing I received from Senior Coordinator Vethral, was that the human signatory body had requested observer status at the previous 2 reviews and been declined on logistical grounds, and that this time the diplomatic calculus had shifted. They were to be included not as a full participant species. The Keth Accords do not list humans as a signatory, and the exercise protocols had not been designed with a human team in mind, but as an advisory delegation. They would run the same simulation scenarios as the other participant species. Their performance data would be recorded. It would inform future interspecies coordination discussions. No one expected anything significant. I want to be precise about that. I am not reconstructing this in hindsight to make myself look reasonable. At the time of the briefing, no member of the evaluation panel, myself included, assigned the human inclusion more than marginal interest. Humans had a military reputation, yes. There were accounts in circulation. But military reputation in the field is a different matter from crisis doctrine performance, which is a highly specific cognitive and organizational capacity that does not map neatly onto battlefield capability. We had seen plenty of species with formidable combat records perform poorly in crisis doctrine simulations. Combat is sequential. Crisis response is simultaneous, cascading, and unresolvable in the short term. Different skill sets. The human delegation arrived at Outpost Keth-Davorn 4 days before the simulation window. There were 6 of them. I met them on the 2nd day during the pre-exercise orientation briefing. I will describe them as I noted them at the time, before the simulation ran, because I think it is important to establish what they looked like before I describe what they did. There were 3 men and 3 women, ranging in apparent age from early adulthood to middle age. Their senior representative introduced herself as Commander Yara Austin. She had the kind of posture that read as military even in a room where she was sitting down, not rigid, not performative, just settled and attentive. The others had a similar quality of stillness, not tense, not visibly eager. They listened to the orientation briefing with their full attention and asked 3 questions at the end, all of which were technical questions about the simulation parameters. Not questions about outcomes, not questions about what other species had scored. Technical questions. One of the men, a younger one with a short beard who I later learned was their logistics coordinator, took written notes on physical paper with a stylus, which struck me as a curious choice in a room full of holographic data panels. I remember noting it. I did not note it as significant. I noted it the way you note an unfamiliar habit. They thanked the briefers. They left. I thought nothing more about them until the simulation. The exercise runs over 3 consecutive days. The first day is Scenario Alpha, what we call a Tier 3 event, which is a serious crisis with significant casualties but a modeled recovery pathway. A stellar impact scenario affecting 1 inhabited world, 3 million population scale, impact timeline of approximately 400 hours from detection. The scenario is designed to be solvable. It has been solved in the sense of achieving an acceptable outcome by 9 of the 14 signatory species in prior exercises. It requires rapid triage, resource coordination across multiple systems, and a clear chain of prioritized decisions. It is difficult. It is not overwhelming. The second day is Scenario Beta, a Tier 4 event, a multi-system cascading failure. I will not describe the full parameters here, but the key distinction from Tier 3 is that Beta has no clean solution path. There are multiple valid approaches, none of which resolve all consequences. Some populations cannot be saved no matter what decisions are made. The scenario is designed to force triage under conditions of irreducible loss. In 22 years, I have never seen a species emerge from scenario beta without showing some measurable organizational degradation. The best performing team we had ever run, a Solveth consensus group, maintained coordinated function through approximately 80% of the scenario before their deliberation cycle began to fracture. That was the record. The third day is Scenario Gamma. I want to be careful about how I describe Scenario Gamma because the full parameters of the scenario are themselves restricted access, for reasons that will become clear. What I can tell you is that Scenario Gamma is a Tier 5 event. It has no recovery pathway. The modeled outcome in every parameter variant we run ends with population mortality above 70% across at least 2 inhabited systems. The point of Scenario Gamma is not to achieve a good outcome. No good outcome is achievable. The point is to find out how an organization functions when it knows, with operational certainty, that it has lost and must continue to make decisions anyway. In 11 years of running Gamma, no team had ever functioned coherently past the 60-minute mark. Most fragmented well before that. We had never run Gamma with a human team. No one on the evaluation panel thought to discuss this as a special consideration. I include that detail because I think it reflects something. Day 1, Scenario Alpha. The evaluation panel occupied the observation gallery above the simulation chamber floor. The chamber itself was a large circular space with modular workstations, holographic data displays, and full-spectrum environmental controls. The simulation team could adjust lighting, temperature, atmospheric pressure, and acoustic conditions to match whatever operational environment the scenario called for. For Alpha, the chamber was set to standard operational parameters: bright overhead panels, cool ambient temperature, neutral atmospheric profile. The human team occupied their assigned workstations in the third ring from the center. They had brought the same equipment they had brought to the orientation briefing: data tablets, physical notebooks, and this, I noticed immediately, a small hand-drawn chart on actual physical paper that Commander Austin pinned to the side of her workstation with what appeared to be a fastening clip. The scenario began. All 6 of them looked at the incoming data simultaneously. For approximately 8 seconds, they were quiet. Then they began to work. I am going to try to describe what working looked like for them in a way that is precise enough to be useful. It was not loud. That was the first thing I noticed. In prior simulations, across species, an alpha-tier event produced an immediate rise in verbal output as participants processed the scenario and began issuing and responding to guidance. The Orvith collective teams were the most communicative, their integration protocols producing a dense continuous stream of cross-node exchange. Even quieter species like the Verath showed elevated decision call frequency in the first 15 minutes. Volume was, in my experience, a marker of engagement. The human team was quiet. Not silent, they spoke, but they spoke in short, functional exchanges. Commander Austin issued 5 statements in the first 10 minutes. Not questions, not discussions. Statements. Yannick, impact vectors on the secondary shelf. Kess, what's the evac window if we hold the inner ring vessels for the tertiary population? That's the wrong triage order. Start from the tail. Each statement was met with a response of equivalent brevity. Acknowledgement, data, correction, further acknowledgement. I clocked the exchange rate at approximately 3 to 5 communications per minute across the entire team. The Solveth consensus group, running a comparable alpha scenario in their prior exercise, had produced 48 communications per minute. But the human team's decision velocity, the rate at which they were actually advancing through the scenario's required decision tree, was faster than anything I had a prior benchmark for. I pulled up the decision advance tracking overlay. It plots a team's progress through a scenario's core decision nodes in real time against a projected optimal path. In a well-functioning team, the actual path curves close to the optimal. In a team under stress, the paths diverge missed nodes, cycling back, abortive branches. The overlay for the human team showed a decision path so close to optimal that I initially assumed the tracking system had misread their workstation inputs. I asked our simulation systems technician to verify. She verified. The path was real. They solved alpha in 3 hours and 12 minutes. The previous best time record was 4 hours and 40 minutes, set by a Verath command team 6 years ago. I will tell you in the interest of accuracy that I did not find this alarming. Impressive, yes. I noted it in my running log, but alpha is a solvable scenario. Humans have a documented military history. Commander Austin clearly had operational experience. A well-trained 6-person team with good communication discipline, presented with a difficult but ultimately resolvable problem, could produce strong results. I filed the note and calibrated my expectations slightly upward for beta. Nothing I calibrated for beta was adequate. Day 2, Scenario Beta. I watched the scenario parameters load into the chamber's display architecture and noted, as I always did on beta, the moment when the modeled mortality numbers appeared in the overview panel. That moment in every prior exercise with every prior species produced a visible response in the simulation team, not always dramatic, sometimes subtle. A pause, a shift in posture, a change in vocal register, but always something. The numbers were not abstract. They represented populations. Beta was designed to make certain of this. The simulation team was required at scenario initialization to visually confirm receipt of the projected mortality range before proceeding. Commander Austin confirmed receipt. She said, acknowledged, and turned to her team. They went to work. I am going to be careful here, because what I observed over the next 6 hours is the core of the report and the core of what I cannot adequately explain in clinical language. I will try to describe it factually, and then tell you what I could not make clinical. In the first 20 minutes, the human team's functioning looked, to the observation gallery, essentially the same as it had in alpha. Brief communications, high decision velocity, the same physical stillness, no visible agitation, no elevated movement, no signs of the postural responses our behavioral monitoring array was calibrated to detect as stress indicators. I was watching the behavioral monitoring readout in the corner of my panel. The array plots 6 physiological and behavioral markers associated with acute stress response across 7 reference species. For the human team, the array was showing readings I initially interpreted as an equipment calibration issue. Every marker associated with acute stress response was registering. Every one. Elevated cardiovascular output, elevated cortisol analog indicators in the cutaneous emission profile, elevated pupillary dilation, elevated micromuscle activation in the jaw and shoulder groups. The human team was physiologically under significant stress. The behavioral correlates, the outputs we would normally expect from that physiological state, were absent. In every species we had modeled, physiological stress of that magnitude produced one of 3 behavioral patterns: fight orientation, increased vocalization, increased movement, increased aggressive decision-making with decreased accuracy; flight orientation, decision latency, communication withdrawal, slowing of decision advance; or freeze, complete suspension of coordinated function, high communication failure rate. The monitoring array existed to catch these patterns early, so we could track how they propagated through a team's organizational structure. The human team's behavioral output did not match any of the 3 patterns. The monitoring array, lacking a reference category, flagged the readings as anomalous and displayed a warning indicator I had never seen it produce before. A yellow triangle that meant, in the array's diagnostic language, that it could not classify the observed state against known parameters. I asked Dr. Vethwarao, our embedded xenobiologist, what he made of the physiological readings. He studied them for a moment and said that the stress indicators were consistent with what he would expect from a team under significant cognitive and emotional load. I asked him about the behavioral correlates. He looked at the chamber floor for a long moment and said he wasn't certain. At the 40-minute mark, Scenario Beta introduced its first irreducible loss event, the moment in the scenario where the decision tree forces an acknowledgement that some portion of the modeled population cannot be saved regardless of subsequent decisions. In prior exercises, this was the fracture point. Not always immediately, but reliably within 10 minutes of the event. The Solveth record holders had held coherent function for 30 minutes past this point. Most teams fractured inside 5. Commander Austin's team received the irreducible loss notification. I watched the chamber floor. She said, "Yannick, update the survival architecture for the remaining zones. We work from what's possible." 4 words of acknowledgement came back across the team. They continued. They did not slow down. The behavioral monitoring array was now producing the yellow triangle across 4 of the 6 individual readouts. Dr. Vethwaral had moved from his seat to stand directly behind the panel, watching. I had not seen him do that before. At the 2-hour mark, Beta introduced the secondary cascade event, a scenario complication that invalidates a portion of the decisions the team has already made and forces partial rebuild of the response architecture. In prior exercises, this event was typically the final fragmentation trigger for teams that had held together through the first irreducible loss event. The Solveth team had fragmented here. Everyone else had fragmented well before this point. The human team received the secondary cascade notification. I watched Commander Austin's posture. I was watching very carefully. She inhaled once slowly. Then she said to her team, "We've lost the outer ring architecture. Kess, reconstruct from the transport nodes. Everyone else hold your sectors." The word hold was the entirety of the instruction. The team, without further discussion, did exactly that. I looked at the decision advance tracking overlay. They were still on the optimal path. Not approximately on the optimal path. Not within a reasonable deviation band of the optimal path. The exact path. After a secondary cascade event that had collapsed the prior 2 hours of coordinated decision-making into partial failure, the human team had, in approximately 4 minutes of reorientation, rebuilt their approach and returned to optimal decision velocity. I want to describe something about those 4 minutes because it is easy to say reoriented and lose what actually happened. What I observed in real time was this. Commander Austin did not freeze. She did not spend 30 seconds visually processing what had just broken. She received the cascade notification, said what I reported above, and the team moved. Not chaotically, cleanly, in the way a structure that has anticipated failure redistributes weight. It was as if the possibility that the outer ring architecture might collapse had already been accounted for somewhere in their planning, not as a discrete contingency they had filed and retrieved, but as a general orientation. Things break, you work with what remains. I pulled up the communication log for those 4 minutes. There were 7 exchanges across the full team. 7. The Solveth consensus group, in the same scenario window at their best performance, had produced over 200 intragroup communications during their attempt to rebuild after the secondary cascade. Most of them, the analysis later showed, cycling through the same decision loops without advancing. The human team produced 7 targeted exchanges, each of which moved the rebuild forward by a concrete step. When I read through the transcript later, the structure was remarkable. No one repeated what someone else had already said. No one went back to a decision that had already been made. The communication had no waste in it. Dr. Vethwaral, beside me in the gallery, said very quietly, "They've already accepted it." I looked at him. He nodded toward the chamber floor. He said, "They're not processing what was lost. They moved past it. They're working with the new architecture." I said, "How?" He said, "I don't know, but look at the stress indicators." He pointed to the array. The stress readings had not dropped. If anything, they were slightly elevated from the pre-cascade level. The cascade had been real, the physiological response was real, and the team was working at full effective capacity regardless. He said, "The stress isn't suppressed, they're just not spending it on grief." That was his word, grief, for a 2-hour-old decision architecture that had just been invalidated by a scenario event. He used the word without self-consciousness, and I did not challenge it, and later I thought about it for a long time. I sat back in my chair and did not say anything for what I am told, by the review of my session recording, was approximately 90 seconds. The scenario ran for a total of 6 hours and 14 minutes. The Vthrani doctrine standard for a beta simulation is 4 hours, which means a team is expected to reach either a resolution state or a total fragmentation event within that window. At 4 hours, the human team had not fragmented. They had not reached a resolution state, because beta has no resolution state in the traditional sense. There is only the triage endpoint, where you have made all the decisions that can be made, and you are accounting for everything that cannot be recovered. They reached the triage endpoint at 5 hours and 47 minutes. The triage endpoint is not a victory. I want to be clear about this. At the triage endpoint of scenario beta, the modeled casualty count for the human team's run was approximately 900,000. The simulation's minimum achievable count, under perfect optimal play, is approximately 780,000. No team had ever come within 200,000 of that minimum before. The human team came within 120,000. After they reached the triage endpoint, Commander Austin sat back from her workstation for the first time in nearly 6 hours. She exhaled. She rubbed the back of her neck with one hand. Then she said something to her team. I could not hear it through the chamber monitoring at that volume, and several of them made quiet sounds that I could not interpret from the gallery. Not distress, something else. I wrote in my session log, beta complete. Human team performance outside prior parameters. Request consult with Dr. Vethwarao before Gamma. I met with Dr. Vethwarao that evening. He had been reviewing the behavioral monitoring data for the previous 6 hours. I asked him what he had found. He said, the physiological stress indicators climbed throughout the scenario. They were at maximum registered output by the time the secondary cascade hit. By the clinical markers, that team was under more acute systemic stress than any simulation participant I have ever monitored. I said, and the behavior? He said, the behavior did not track the physiology in any way I have a reference for. The stress was there, every indicator, but the channeling of it. He stopped. He said, in every species I have studied, severe acute stress produces a narrowing of cognitive function. The decision space contracts. You stop being able to think about the larger picture. You think about the immediate threat, the immediate solution, and everything else falls away. That's the mechanism behind cascade failure. You lose the architecture because the architecture requires you to hold too many things simultaneously, and the stress response eliminates that capacity. I said, and the humans? He said, the humans were also narrowing. The physiological signature was there, but he paused again, and I watched a very careful, very senior scientist search for precise language. What they were narrowing toward was not the immediate threat. They were narrowing toward the problem, the whole problem. It was as if the stress response, rather than collapsing the decision space, was collimating it, making it more precise, more focused, not smaller, finer. I thought about that word. Collimating. It is a technical term from optical physics, taking divergent light and making the rays parallel, focused, coherent. I had never heard it applied to cognition. I asked Dr. Vethwarao what he made of it physiologically. He said, I don't have a mechanism. The neurological architecture would have to be doing something very different from what I would expect. I can describe what I observed. I cannot explain it. I said, "We run Gamma tomorrow." He looked at me, he said, "I know." Day 3, Scenario Gamma. I am going to describe this carefully because I am aware that some of what I observed during Gamma falls outside the bounds of what a formal doctrine report can adequately contain, and I want this record, the one I am making now, separate from the 41-page file, to be complete. Before the scenario initialized, I spoke with Commander Austin in the corridor outside the chamber. This was not protocol. Evaluation panel members are not supposed to have direct contact with simulation participants between sessions. I chose to make this exception because of what we had observed in beta, and because I felt, as the senior doctrine analyst on site, that I had a responsibility to assess the situation before proceeding. I told her, in terms that were honest without being specific, that Scenario Gamma was qualitatively different from the prior 2 scenarios. I told her that the scenario was designed to produce a no-recovery outcome, and that the evaluation protocol was measuring organizational function under those conditions, not the achievement of a solution. She listened, she nodded, she said, "I understand." I said, "I want to make certain the parameters are clear. The scenario is not solvable. There is no acceptable outcome in the modeling." She said, "I understand that." I said, "How your team," I stopped. What I had been going to say was how your team responds to that awareness. What I actually said after a moment was, "Are you prepared?" She looked at me. It was not a long look, but it was the kind of look that carries a complete sentence that the speaker has decided not to say aloud. Then she said, "We've been in situations where the numbers don't work. You still have to make the best decisions you can with what you have." I went back to the observation gallery. The scenario initialized. I will describe the first hour of Gamma in less detail than I described Alpha and Beta, because the first hour was, in form if not in substance, similar to what I had observed over the previous 2 days. The human team received the scenario parameters, confirmed the mortality projections, which were catastrophic from the opening frame, and began to work. The same brevity of communication, the same decision velocity. The behavioral monitoring array immediately flagged anomalous readings, which, at this point, I had been expecting. What changed was the scenario. Gamma is calibrated to escalate. The opening parameters are terrible. They worsen. At the 15-minute mark, a scenario event eliminates one of the team's primary response pathways, and the mortality projections worsen by approximately 20%. At the 30-minute mark, a second event eliminates the primary logistics architecture, and the projections worsen again. At the 45-minute mark, there is what the simulation team calls the pivot event, a scenario condition that forces an explicit acknowledgement, in writing, that a specific population segment, numbered, named in the simulation, assigned to a designated regional node, cannot be reached in time and will be lost in totality. The pivot event is the moment at which every prior simulation team has ceased to function coherently. Not because it is the worst casualty figure in the scenario, it is not, but because it is the first moment in Gamma where the simulation requires a participant to, in effect, write off a life total in the official scenario record, to look at a number and a name and say, "Yes, we acknowledge that these are gone, and we are proceeding without them." It is the moment where the math becomes, in a very specific way, deliberate, not the math of the crisis happening to them, the math they are making. At 46 minutes, the pivot event notification appeared on Commander Austin's primary display. The chamber was quiet. I was watching the chamber floor and also watching my own readouts, the decision advance tracker, the behavioral monitoring array, the communication frequency log, and I was watching Dr. Vethwaral in my peripheral vision because I had noticed, in the previous hour, that his physical responses to what he was observing had become a useful secondary indicator. Commander Austin looked at the notification. She looked at it for a long time by the standards of this team, perhaps 8 seconds. Then she said, very quietly to no one in particular, "Acknowledged." She picked up the physical stylus, the same one from the orientation briefing, and she wrote something in her physical notebook. I could not see what. She closed the notebook. "Yannick," she said, "give me the southern corridor." They continued. At the 1 hour mark, I became aware that something unusual was happening in the observation gallery. The gallery held 11 people: myself, Dr. Vethwarao, the 7 other evaluation panel members, and 2 Orvith military observers who had been assigned to the exercise as neutral parties. I became aware, first, that the gallery was very quiet, quieter than observation galleries typically are during a simulation, where there is usually ongoing technical exchange between panel members about what they are seeing. I became aware, second, that several of my colleagues had stopped looking at their individual data panels and were looking instead directly down at the chamber floor. At 64 minutes, scenario gamma crossed its standard fragmentation threshold, the point in the scenario timeline past which no simulation team had ever maintained coherent organizational function. The threshold is marked in the scenario tracking system with a small indicator line. I watched it pass. The human team continued. At the 90-minute mark, the scenario introduced its worst event, what the simulation team designates as the terminal cascade, a scenario condition where 2 of the 3 remaining active response architectures collapse simultaneously, and the team is left with 1 functional pathway and projected mortality above the 90 percentile threshold. In 11 years, no team had been present in a coherent state to receive the terminal cascade notification. It had never needed to do anything other than exist in the scenario timeline, because by the time it arrived, the team was always already gone. Commander Austin's team received the terminal cascade notification. I will tell you with complete accuracy what happened next, because I wrote it in my session log in real time and I have the recording. The 6 of them stopped working for precisely 11 seconds. I counted. The chamber was absolutely silent. The behavioral monitoring array, for those 11 seconds, showed physiological readings that Dr. Vethwarao later described to me as the highest acute stress indicators he had ever recorded in a non-emergency setting. Every marker was at maximum registered output. Some markers were above maximum registered output, which meant the array had hit its calibration ceiling. Then Commander Austin said, "1 path left." And they continued. They were not the same in the final 40 minutes. I want to describe this correctly. They were not quieter, they had always been quiet. They were not slower, they maintained decision velocity within 5% of their prior rate, which was, in itself, an impossibility I had no language for. The difference was something I can only describe as a quality of attention. In Alpha and Beta, the team's attention had been distributed across the scenario. 6 people working 6 separate problem domains that intersected and required coordination. In the final 40 minutes of Gamma, the team's attention had collapsed inward, and not in the way I would have expected from a fragmentation event. It had collapsed inward in the way that I searched for an analogy, and I found one later, reading through the old Vthrani field observation archives. In the way that a hand closes around something it has decided to hold on to. They were not going to let go of the last path. The scenario ended at 2 hours and 7 minutes, not because the human team had reached a resolution state, and not because they had fragmented, because the scenario had run its full parameters and the simulation system had concluded the exercise. Gamma is not designed to have an ending that a team can reach. It runs to its preset clock. The human team was still working, still making decisions, still advancing through the terminal decision tree, when the simulation system announced the exercise conclusion. Commander Austin looked up at the announcement. She leaned back in her chair. She was very still for a moment. Then she looked down at her notebook. She sat like that for perhaps 30 seconds, not reading it, just looking at it. Then she closed it and set it flat on the workstation. The observation gallery did not speak for quite a long time. I want to describe the debrief accurately, and I am going to try. Protocol requires a post-simulation debrief with the simulation team within 2 hours of the final session concluding. The format is straightforward. We review the major decision nodes, we identify key performance data, we record any anomalies. It is not an evaluation in the sense of a judgment. It is a data collection. The simulation team answers questions. We record the answers, and that data goes into the exercise report. The debrief room was adjacent to the simulation chamber. The human team had been given a 30-minute break. When they came in, they looked, and I want to be precise about this, tired. Not devastated, not broken. Tired the way people look when they have worked very hard for a very long time. Commander Austin had the notebook with her. The man with the physical stylus, Yannick, she had called him, whose full name was in the manifest as Lieutenant Commander Yannick Sarret, had his data tablet open but was not looking at it. I conducted the debrief. I asked the standard questions. I received standard answers about the decision architecture, the triage methodology, the resource allocation logic. I wrote them down. They answered cleanly and without evasion. They were good at explaining their own decision processes, which is itself a useful data point. A team that has been working at very high intensity is often unable, in debrief, to articulate its own reasoning, because the reasoning happened too fast or because they have already started to process the emotional aftermath of the scenario. The human team could articulate it. I had been working toward a question since the observation gallery, and I asked it near the end of the debrief. I said, in scenario gamma, the parameters produced no survivable outcome. The modeled mortality was above 90% at the terminal cascade point. At that stage of the simulation, what were you trying to accomplish? There was a brief silence, not uncomfortable, considering. Commander Austin said, we were trying to find the people we could still reach. I wrote that down, I said, even with the overall outcome fixed. She said, the overall outcome wasn't fixed, the number was. The number and the outcome aren't the same thing. She paused. There were still specific people in the simulation, specific population nodes, where the pathway wasn't closed. We knew we couldn't change the total. We were trying to not waste the pathways that were still open. I said, at what point does it stop being rational to continue optimizing within a total loss scenario? She looked at me. She did not look at me unkindly. She said, what would stopping have accomplished? I wrote that down too. I said, I'm asking from a doctrine perspective. There is an argument that continuing to optimize within a no-recovery framework consumes cognitive resources that could be preserved for a subsequent scenario, if one follows the terminal event. She said, I understand the argument. She thought for a moment. We don't really think that way. If there's something you can do, you do it, and then when there's nothing you can do, you stop. You don't stop early because you've decided the accounting doesn't justify the effort. Across from her, Lieutenant Commander Sarret nodded once without looking up from the table. I said, is that a training principle or something else? She considered this for longer than the other questions. Then she said, I think it's something else. I think it's, she stopped. There's an old saying, I don't know where it started, something like, you don't get to decide in advance what's worth trying for. You try and then you find out. She looked at the table. Then she said, we don't think about what's possible ahead of time. We think about what's in front of us. The assessment of what's possible, we do that after. The debrief concluded. The human team filed out. I sat in the debrief room for a while after they left. I have, in 22 years of doctrine analysis, debriefed approximately 200 simulation teams across 11 species. I have a reasonable sense, after that many debriefs, of what the answers to debrief questions actually contain. The clinical answers, the decision rationale, the triage logic, the resource prioritization, that is the surface layer. What the debrief also captures, if you are listening for it, is the organizational culture that produced the decisions. How a species thinks about crisis. What category of thing a crisis is for them. For the Verath, a crisis is a hierarchy problem. Something has disrupted the chain. The resolution is to re-establish the chain. For the Solveth, a crisis is a consensus failure. Something has happened that the collective has not yet integrated. The resolution is to reach integration. For the Orveth collective, a crisis is a systemic disruption requiring node-level sacrifice for collective preservation. The resolution is to identify the sacrifice correctly. I sat in the debrief room and I tried to find the category, for humans, of what a crisis is. What I kept returning to was what Commander Austin had said. If there's something you can do, you do it. Not if the expected value justifies the effort. Not if the hierarchy supports the action. Not if the collective can integrate the decision. If there's something you can do. The assessment of what's possible, she had said, we do that after. That, I thought, was not a doctrine position. It was older than a doctrine position. It was prior to doctrine. It was something built into the way the species approached the category of crisis at a level below policy, below training, below even culture in the institutional sense. It was in the underlying calculus. The question they asked when a crisis appeared was not, what is the optimal expected value response given current parameters and survivability modeling? The question was, in some sense, the only question they apparently knew how to ask. What can we still do? And then they did it until they couldn't, and then they stopped. That is not a rational framework for crisis response, in the sense that the emergency doctrine conclave uses the word rational. It is not calibrated to optimal resource preservation. It is not calibrated to survivability probability. It is calibrated to something else, and I have spent 11 months trying to name what it is calibrated to, and I have not successfully named it. What I have identified, in the 11 months since the exercise, is the following. The standard model of acute stress response across all species we have studied is based on a fundamental premise, that under sufficient systemic threat, the cognitive system prioritizes its own continuation. This produces the narrowing. The decision space collapses around survival. Coordinated function fails because coordinated function is expensive and survival is the only economy that matters when the threat is severe enough. I spent a great deal of time in the months after the exercise reviewing the existing literature on human crisis response. There is not much of it in the conclave's archives. Humans are not a signatory species, and the majority of what exists is military observation records and a handful of field reports from the early contact period, most of which focus on combat behavior rather than organizational behavior. What there is, however, is consistent on one point. Humans in extremis do not behave the way the standard stress response model predicts. There are accounts in the contact period archives from observers who had watched human populations face natural catastrophes, geological events, atmospheric events, the kind of sudden civilizational disruptions that would, in most species, produce system-level collapse. The accounts note, with varying degrees of bewilderment, that human populations in these situations exhibit what the old observers called spontaneous coordination. Not coordination produced by existing command structures, though those contribute. Coordination that emerges from the situation itself. Ordinary individuals, with no prior connection, no assigned roles, no command authority, organizing around the immediate problem and working it. The observers at the time attributed this to cultural conditioning, or to specific individual heroism, or to various other explanations that, in retrospect, seem to be working around the thing rather than at it. I no longer think it is cultural conditioning. I think culture is where this tendency expresses itself. I do not think culture is where it originates. What I watched in the simulation chamber was 6 people from different backgrounds, different training contexts, different specializations, all converging on the same operational mode the moment the scenario got bad enough. Not converging because they had been trained to converge, converging because the training had found something already there and given it direction. The substrate was the same in all of them. The human team did not follow this model. The behavioral monitoring data shows that the stress response was fully present in some cases, more fully present than in any prior simulation participant. The physiological cascade was real. The human team was not unaffected by scenario gamma. They were, by every measurable indicator, profoundly affected by it. But the cognitive response to that cascade was, and I am using Dr. Vethwaral's word because I still think it is the best one available, collimating. The stress response was narrowing their attention, yes, but what it was narrowing their attention toward was not their own preservation. It was toward the problem in front of them, the people they could still reach, the paths that were not yet closed. It is as if the circuit that in every other species we have studied routes the stress response toward self-preservation had been in humans rewired, not removed, not suppressed, rewired toward something external, toward whatever they had decided mattered. I do not know when this happened in human evolutionary history. I do not know if it was deliberate, in the sense that any evolutionary process is deliberate. I know that it is real, because I watched it function in real time, in a simulation environment that was specifically designed to break it. It did not break. After the exercise, I asked Commander Austin in a private conversation whether she thought her team's performance had been representative. She considered this carefully. She said, "I think we had a good team. But what you saw today, the way we work when things get bad, I don't think that's special to us. I think most people are like this, given the right," she searched for the word, "the right grounding." I asked her what she meant by grounding. She said, "Something worth holding on to, someone you're trying to get back to, or a job you've decided to finish, something that's more real to you than the probability numbers." She paused. "When it gets bad enough, the probability numbers stop meaning very much. You just look for what's still possible and you go there." I thanked her. She nodded. She shook my hand, which is a human physical greeting convention I was not expecting. I filed the 41 pages, 11 days, after returning from Keth Davorn. I have not been asked to finalize the doctrinal review, because no one on the panel has submitted their review recommendations, and as of 11 months ago, I stopped expecting them to. The exercise data is sitting in a Tier 5 archive, which means it exists and is inaccessible, which is, I think, the outcome that most of the panel has quietly settled on as preferable to the alternative. The alternative is to decide what to do with what we learned. What we learned is this: there is a species in this galaxy that functions better under existential pressure than it does under normal conditions. Not marginally better, not in specific domains, better across every measurable coordination and decision-making parameter we track, in direct proportion to the severity of the crisis. The worse the situation becomes, the more precisely they work, the more clearly they see what is possible, the more completely they commit to the paths that remain open. We do not have a classification heading for this. The monitoring array did not have a classification heading for it either, and the array has been classifying crisis response patterns for 31 years. Commander Austin, when I shook her hand at the end of the exercise, she looked, as I said, tired, not broken. The expression on her face was the expression of someone who had spent a long day doing a very hard thing and had done it as well as it could be done and now needed to sleep. That was all. The scenario had been a catastrophe. The modeled numbers had been catastrophic. She had written something in that notebook at the pivot event, and she had not reopened it. I have thought about what she wrote. I do not know. I did not ask. I think about the 11 seconds when they stopped. After the terminal cascade, when the last path shrank to 1. 11 seconds of silence, maximum output stress indicators across all 6 physiological monitoring arrays, and then one flat sentence. 1 path left. And then they went down it. I have been trying, for 11 months, to decide what category of thing that is. I have not found a category in the Conclave's doctrine library that fits. I have not found a category in the field observation archives. I have not found it in any of the interspecies comparative behavioral literature I have reviewed. What I have found, in my own notes from the debrief, written in the margin beside Commander Austin's line about the assessment of what's possible, I find it after, she said, we do it first, is a word I wrote for myself that is not a clinical term, and that did not make it into the 41 pages. The word is relentless. Not as a military description, not as a behavioral classification, as the closest word I could find in my own language for a thing I had not needed a word for before. A species that, when you reduce its situation to a single remaining option, does not ask whether the option is sufficient, does not ask whether the effort is justified by the probability, does not measure the cost against the return. It looks at the path and goes. The report will sit in the archive. The review will not conclude. The doctrinal implications are, I think, simply larger than the process was designed to handle, and the panel has made the collective institutional judgment that it is easier not to. I understand the judgment. I am not certain I agree with it. I am not certain, 11 months later, that I have finished deciding what I think. What I know is what I saw on day 3. 6 people in a simulation chamber, the numbers long past recoverable, 1 path open, and not one of them suggesting they stop. Not because they didn't understand the arithmetic. They understood it perfectly. Because the arithmetic, this is what I keep coming back to, this is the thing I cannot file away into clinical language and close. The arithmetic was not the question they were asking. They were asking a different question. And 11 months later, sitting with 41 pages of restricted analysis, and a word written in the margin of my own notes that I cannot put into doctrine language, I am beginning to think that the question they were asking is the right one. I don't have a classification heading for that either.